Welcome back to Incremental, the continuous improvement podcast. This is our concepts edition for the week. I'm Devin Bedoni.
And I'm Uriel Eisen.
And today we're going to have a loose focus on problem solving in a business. And Uriel, you've got a quote.
Quote for the episode is, "Before you say you can't do something, try it." From Sakichi Toyoda. The Toyota, and it was a quote from the book, The Toyota Engagement Equation, which I just started. This is something that's really been on my mind lately. And I could, like, on both sides of this, I'm sort of like wrestling with this. I think we've talked about this last week, but just this idea of like, how do you decide whether to do things in-house or to buy equipment? Like, do you solve problems for yourself? Do you buy other people's off-the-shelf solution? Toyota says it's like 3 to 5 times cheaper to implement solutions in-house.
Sure.
It feels to me as a small business owner
Not that way. Yeah.
Also, if you think about the example of like putting paper in your printer, I don't think I should be making my own paper.
Right.
Like, so there's like obviously a line there. But in terms of a method of learning, I think it's a great quote, right? Like, I think it's very easy to just write off ideas that you haven't tried.
Yeah, I think there's a good middle ground there too, which is like, not necessarily like you have to try everything, but keep an open mind to it. So like, I think like reading this, you kind of immediately go to, oh, now I'm going to have to test every principle. And I think the corollary to it is like, no, you don't have to test every principle, but don't assume that it's impossible. Like,
yeah.
If you're going to say it's impossible, you better be willing to back it up, kind of, and like test it.
Yeah. What I like, in designing the future, they sort of, they have a phrase, stump the chump, of like oftentimes like engineering meetings can become sort of like a stump the chump, where someone presents their ideas and everyone else is trying to look like smart by sort of asking stumping them, right? Yeah. Instead of it, which is a silly exercise. And instead of that, like oftentimes those people haven't actually tried any of the things being discussed, right, to any degree. Right. I think also a really interesting part about this is I think there's a baseline assumption that you have some understanding about what prototyping is, which I think a lot of people get wrong. Which is like, you can't try something in an expensive, time-consuming way if you're trying to try everything. Right. Right. Like, part of this is sort of like, and also building your systems to allow for people to try things. Like, there's an idea of like no monuments in a factory. Like, if you can, put it on wheels. Like, I've been thinking about our mill. We'll talk about this later in the episode, but I've sort of calculated the money it costs us walking to the mill because it's oriented wrong. And I kind of want to just leave it on air casters.
Oh, interesting. Just like set it
down. And then anytime we want to move it 3 inches, we can. And yes, you have to re-level it, but that's not that time consuming. Also, with these machines, not that essential. Like, you don't need to nail it. Yeah. It's not like a 8-footed lathe where that is the alignment of the machine. Right. Yeah. But yeah, anyway, so just sort of like getting really good at drilling down into what is the problem you're trying to solve and what is the crux of that problem. I think if you're going to try everything, you need to stop building stuff out of like fancy, expensive materials that take a long time and take a lot of engineering. Right. And just like take some cardboard and hot glue and try a thing. Yeah. Anyway.
I'm also kind of like, I like loosely follow Formula One.
Okay. Yeah.
And it's interesting I think it's cool to see like environments where people are just like really good at a specific kind of process. And, like for us to build something in composite is like a huge project. And then you like look at Formula One teams and like everything is made of composite.
Right. They just have like all the tools right there.
Yeah. It's like, that's
tons
like
of materials.
That's the easy thing for them. And it's cool to be like, oh, once you have like a lot of experience and know-how with a process, like and kind of, I guess, bringing that back to prototyping, I think it's good to remember, like, okay, so maybe this is the ideal state, but we're going to do it in whatever it is that we're good at and quick at. Like sometimes that's cardboard.
Our way.
Yeah, in our way.
Yeah.
And it's, initially I was like, God, they make everything out of carbon fiber. That's like so crazy labor intensive. And then at some point it clicked. I was like, no, they're doing that because it's easy. Because they have it.
Right. It always tickles me going into people's shops. Like if you go into a sewing shop, all the organization is sort of like sewn fabrics, right?
Yeah.
Like, and then you go into a welder's shop.
Yeah.
It's fun to see all the different ways of solving the same problem, kind of.
Coram came back from your shop the other day and he was like, everything there is held together with straps.
That's true.
And I was like, yep, they have a lot of them.
We have a lot of them.
And they work pretty good, so I can see why if you had a lot of them around, you'd just use them for everything.
Yeah, it's definitely not the most cost effective, but it is for us.
I mean, they're seconds, right?
Yeah.
So they did cost you money, I guess, but there's no additional money being spent to use them.
No. And sometimes using them, we've had ideas about applications. So,
Interesting.
Yeah, good to see how they work, where they fail, where they're good, where they're not. Yeah, diving more into the problem-solving topic.
Yep.
So I've sort of, I don't know, again, we talked about this last week, but trying to get better at problem-solving, I feel like not enough time, like in our shop, we don't spend enough time on thinking about the problem and really thinking about the problem. I think I've sort of habitually picked up this idea of like, oh, you have a problem. I'm a good problem solver. Here is 10 ideas of how to solve it, which is cool. And I think that's where a lot of people end up. But I think there's a really important step that, like, we do it to some degree, but I just don't think we do it enough, which is identifying the problem. So if you look at, if you look at Toyota's problem-solving A3, they have a good amount of the, a good portion of that A3 page, which is the paper size, is dedicated to that first step of what is your problem. And I think it's just easy to assume you've identified the problem, but like the ask 5 whys, that is all about the fact that we typically are treating a symptom, right? We're typically like, what is the problem? I need to walk to pick up the parts. Oh, conveyor belt. Yeah. Rather than being like, oh, our stations are too far apart. Let's move our stations closer together. Or, I mean, you could go even deeper, right? You could ask. So just trying to become a little bit more methodical about that.
Yeah.
In Strategies for Plant Improvement, I believe it is by Shigeo Shingo, there was a section on sort of problem solving. And so, yeah, he mentions like really identifying the problem and that no solutions should be proposed at that stage.
Yeah.
Which is really hard to do.
It is. I feel like, our early conversations too, well, and still, tend to be like,
have you tried this?
Yeah.
Have you tried that?
What if we did this?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's easy to assume you understand the whole system.
I don't even think we question it. I don't think it's even a part of my current like mental habit is sort of like, stop, there's a problem. Okay, what is actually the problem? Yeah. In life and in business, I think. And so trying to become a little bit more, just methodical about that step. Shigeo Shingo said, if you do have an idea, like it's fine to write it out just so you like to not like just to get it out of your head, but that it's really important to have a whole stage of problem solving that is completely dedicated to identifying the problem and trying to get down to the root cause of the problem.
So I just looked up Toyota A3. Yeah. Because I've read about it a little bit, but definitely needed a refresher. Yeah. And basically, they all follow a same formula. Yeah. Which is, I think, helpful. And so for anybody who's never read about it, I'll just describe it right now. It's called an A3 for anybody who doesn't know because it's done on A3 paper size. that's just what they started with because they found that standard 8.5 by 11 was too small to get the whole situation laid out. So step one is you describe the background. That is like the history, I think, basically, of the situation or the problem that you're facing. Then accurately describing the current condition. And I think those are the fact that those two are separate, I think maybe is important and interesting.
Yeah.
Then describing goals or targets. And these are not solutions. They're what you would like the future state to look like. Then there's an analysis section, which I think is getting towards your solutions.
Is it toward the solution, or is it like documenting current? Like analyzing current?
Trying to zoom in here. I guess it's more specific numbers on current. Like it's like taking the
it's like set a target, understand what the current condition is.
Yep.
In that target's not metrics, but units maybe or something.
I think it's just more in depth of the current condition instead of an overview. It's like specific root causes and stuff. And then proposed countermeasures. And, all of these examples I'm looking at have a couple different solutions. And so these are proposals for how to solve the problem. And then an actual plan, which I think is interesting. And this is something that took me a long time to learn, is the difference between a goal and a plan. And a goal being a state you would like to achieve, and a plan being a series of steps to get there.
Okay.
I know a lot of people, myself included, a lot of people in my life and me historically have been really good at setting goals, not as good at actually establishing a plan to achieve those goals. And it's easy to conflate one for the other.
Yeah.
Just be like, I'm going to do this. Isn't that going to be cool? And then not having a clear step by step of how to get from point A to point B. And then lastly is a follow-up.
Yeah. So that's, again, that can all be broken out into PDCA, plan, do, check, act. But I think it's really interesting. Like, I think part of planning, I maybe habitually am skipping right to the plan solutions, not what exactly is happening, what exactly are we encountering, what does that look like, where do we want to get to, just conceptually.
I think it's not intuitive for those of us who work in these we're in the trenches, in the weeds every day. It's intuitive to feel like we have a complete understanding because we're so in it. And so I think it takes like you have to be very purposeful about stepping out.
I think there's that. I think there's also, and this gets me, transitions me into my rant corner. No, I think there's also in school, we're presented with problems to solve, as in like add these two numbers together, not like, hey, what is, like, there's not much time spent on what is the problem? What should we be thinking?
Why are 2 and 2 next to each other?
Yeah, or like, how, like, word problems allegedly are to learn how to set up problems, right? But even so, those word problems are typically very much catered to the topic of math you're currently learning, not, hey, here's a word problem. Do we know the math to do this? Or do we need to learn something new to figure, right? And like, what would we need to know how to do to make this easy? Yeah. And so I think just through education, just everything is very much like, and also just culturally, there's an emphasis on like results. Yeah. Not long-term results. Like, sort of embrace the grind. It's sort of like just get in there and do it. Do hundreds fast. I don't know. So I think there's a lot of background to that. The other thing that I think is like, I don't know, kind of frustrating to me is I think there's a lot of sort of looking down on trying things that don't pan out. And so we talk about these people who tried things and they do pan out as being brilliant. And we sort of celebrate like when people said it won't work, but then they did it anyway.
Yeah.
And it's like, wait, what about all those people who are saying it won't work? Why aren't they saying that's interesting?
Yeah.
It's great that like you're trying something new.
Yeah.
Like, what do you think you're going to try? I don't know, like being encouraging about trying something new instead of like, I think oftentimes if you do try new things, and as someone who has done that a lot, like people sort of laugh at you when it fails.
Yeah.
Which is sort of annoying because it's like you can't guarantee success. And so you need to encourage a willingness to try.
Yeah.
With the assumption that most of them won't work.
Yeah.
Like you can't be brilliant, I think. I think brilliance is sort of a misnomer.
Uh-huh.
Like inventors and stuff. Okay, maybe like, Tesla. That guy was a nut and also a genius. But I don't think all the ideas in his head weren't good ideas.
Yeah, to your point, he was just willing to try like a bajillion different things.
But didn't he like have a dream about how AC induction motors could work?
Maybe. Yeah, I mean, he was definitely brilliant.
Yeah.
And but I think also it's important to remember that that's like sort of a practiced skill.
Right. And part of it is entertaining ideas that seem dumb.
Yeah.
And are often dumb.
Yeah.
Like I've tried a lot of, anyway,
when he was a kid, he made a motor by gluing beetles to a disc that he put on a pivot. The beetles would try and fly, and because they were glued to it, it would spin. I mean, it didn't power anything.
Right. It's not super practical.
But still, as like a 6-year-old in rural Romania, that's pretty crazy.
That's pretty crazy. But also, I think like, sort of like shame on people who go like, what is the point of that?
Yeah. Kind of. Exactly.
It's like, that's interesting.
Yeah, our school system would have not encouraged more of that behavior, probably.
Yeah, and like, I don't know. I had this, luckily it didn't like go to heart because I think I had like very supportive parents in that regard.
Mm-hmm.
Like, but in high school, I had a chemistry teacher who gave us, like, we were making these bottle rockets where you like pump up a soda bottle with water in it and it shoots off. He gave us exact directions of how to make it. And I redesigned it and mine failed. And he was like laughing. He was like, why would you do that? I was like, I told you how to do it. Why? And I was like, why would you not do it? Like we have 26 other people doing this thing.
Right. You're like, I can see the solution that works as well as it does. Like there's nothing to be gained here except for my excitement in watching this thing blast off.
Yeah. And like the competition was, and the other interesting part was the way mine failed is, it didn't do what I designed it to do at all, but the way it failed was really interesting. And so it basically, I was trying to get a better stabilization so mine would go higher. Uh-huh. But actually the way the competition worked was whose was off the ground for longest as a stand-in for how long it was how high it went.
Oh, interesting, because they couldn't measure that.
And mine didn't go very high. But then it tilted on its side and glided to the ground, which was pretty cool. I forget if I won. I don't really remember if the timing, but it was interesting and like learned something new. Anyway, I just feel like people need to be like more encouraging,
right,
for people to try stuff when it fails, not when it succeeds.
Yeah,
like that's great to celebrate that, but like, you need to build a culture where people actually are trying new things. Yeah,
bringing this home to, actual business and production environments. It seems like the takeaway is basically like creating a culture where when you have a problem that needs to be solved, really encouraging everybody to not be shy.
Yeah, I mean, you can't like pay, it's lip service if you're saying, like Sakichi Toyoda is saying, before you say you can't do something, try it. That's total lip service as a manager.
Yeah.
If you penalize people for trying something that doesn't succeed.
Right.
You need to be like, oh, that's cool. Yeah, totally. Yeah. In this book also they mentioned like management for outcomes versus management for process. Mm. And that Toyota manages for process, as in like, how did you go about problem solving? Not did you come up with something that was good?
Yeah.
And if we all are on board with the process you followed, then it actually, if you have a bad outcome, it's a great opportunity as an organization to update our problem solving methods, because we all get that you're a good person and that you're smart. We hired you. Like, if you're not, it's our fault.
I've worked very hard to take that approach. And I think so far it's paying off. And, there's been some examples where serious mistakes were made.
Yeah.
That resulted in time being spent by all of us, fixing a problem.
Totally.
Like repairing a problem as well as coming up with a solution to the process. And, I think there was expectation of like anger, maybe, some punishment or something, frustration at the very least. And I've just tried to be like, hey, this is not your fault. This is absolutely my fault for assuming something.
Right.
And and secondarily, now we get to learn how to tram in a rotary all together.
Gather around.
Yeah. This is a fantastic learning opportunity that normally we don't make time for. So
and if you want, like, I don't know. I think if you're really pinched for cash, it's hard to stay in that mindset. Not to say it's impossible, but sure. I think it makes it harder. If you look at like Bell Labs and the inventions that they contributed to our society,
sure.
and then you read a book about what was happening over there, basically they had so much money coming in from a monopoly that they just hired the best people and said, go nuts.
Mm-hmm.
There weren't any expected outcomes. Like, right? That was it. And they invented a ton of stuff. I mean, like the one guy built a maze. So I forget the guy's name. Built a mechanical mouse that would solve a maze, all with vacuum tubes, like all the logic.
Whoa.
To solve mazes.
That's wild.
Mean, just like, I forget his name, but he was like, early machine learning contributor.
Right. And you're like, you look at that at face value and you're like, what?
In what world? Who's buying that?
How is that helpful? And then you're like, oh, that,
And it wasn't helpful for them for many,
sure.
Some of their stuff was, but a lot of it was like really foundational research that took many years to find a commercial application. But I just think that tells you that building an environment where people can be creative. We have like, I forget what it is, 10 trillion synapses in our head.
I don't know.
It's a huge number.
Yeah.
And I think like people who come up with very out of the box solutions are kind of weird, because like those areas of the brain that we all have are just like talking to each other a little differently, like for better and for worse. Right. And so, but I think you need to take a lot of pressure off for that to all kind of come out.
Yeah. Interesting.
Anyway, so I'm trying to become a little bit more methodical about how we problem solve. I think I want to print out some A3s, just because like I just feel like I need to build that habit of, all right, we're filling this out. And we were on the phone the other day having this, and it really immediately, my gut instinct when talking through a new problem, it just really feels like I understand the problem. And it's like, feels like a waste of time to just sort of back off any solutions and just really think hard about the problem.
Yeah.
I don't know. So I think it's going to be hard
to
make that my habit.
And I think maybe the cool thing about the A3 is that like, you can't,
it's like
you have to do step one.
Yeah. You only filled out 3/4 of that page. Like I can see that big blank top left corner. What's happening there? Anyway,
do we want to talk? I feel like we throw out the PDCA thing a lot, and on the one hand, it's pretty simple, but it might be worth, just like I just looked it up again because make sure I understand correctly. But it's also referred to as the Deming cycle. I guess it was brought to Japan by Edward Deming. And is he the guy that was Shigio's like sort of inspiration early on?
Shigio talks about I forget his first name, but Gerbreath.
That's right.
I've heard the name Deming a lot. I haven't really looked into who he was.
Yeah.
Quick Wikipedia search.
Yeah. Anyway, so the PDCA cycle has 4 stages. As we said, plan, do, check, act. And then what does that mean? Plan is determine goals for a process and needed changes to achieve them. Do is implement the changes. Check is evaluate the results in terms of performance. And act is standardize and stabilize the change or begin the cycle again depending on the results. And when the common visualization when talking about this in continuous improvement is the PDCA loop as a wheel going up a hill. And every time you do a cycle, you kind of create a new standard that is a flat on the hill where you can sort of reference.
Oh, interesting. That's a nice graphic.
That sort of keeps you from rolling back to an earlier state. So you do a PDCA loop, you create a new standard of quality and production improvement.
Right.
And then you start the cycle over again and continue to improve from that sort of backstop or reference. So on the one hand, it's not very complicated. On the other hand, actually implementing it is fairly involved.
Very involved. I think people tend to skip the first step and the last step.
Yeah.
And this is another piece we're dealing with. The first step I just talked about, right? Like really nailing down the problem.
Yeah.
In the planning phase. So we do like a quarter of the first step, sort of just coming up with proposed countermeasures, essentially. And then it's easy to do the doing of like, okay, new whatever, let's implement that. I think the stabilizing thing is really, really not done.
In your business or in general?
In general, and in my business. So one thing we're really struggling with at the moment is we've now made a lot of SOPs.
Yeah.
It's really nice that they exist because it's a useful training tool. It's it's nice to know we have like a clear document of this is how it's done. And I do reference them from time to time, but it's rare.
Yeah.
And it is really problematic because it is like the tool for both organizational learning and improvements is having a stable, so the problem is that the way I do the work and the way, say, Sam does the work, if there's any difference, it doesn't matter from I don't know. I think people's interpretation can easily become like sort of controlling instead of an ability for like Sam wrote an SOP of how he does it. I go and do it. And I'm like, wait a second, I do it this other way and it's way faster. In most organizations, there's no document to compare. Like I'm not forced to try it Sam's way. And so I never tell Sam, hey, I'm doing it this other way.
Yeah.
And so there's no progress. And so like something I'm trying to figure out is how do we become more diligent about working from SOPs religiously? Like that you're actually looking at it, right? Step 1, what is step 1? Okay, I'm going to do step 1. Step 2, what is step 2? Okay, I'm doing step 2. Because it feels like you're slowing down.
You are slowing down.
Yeah, almost definitely. But I think there's huge potential upsides in doing that, both in terms of catching mistakes in the SOP, updating it, learning new things, but then it also enables you to find those flats and not backslide.
Yeah. I think the solution probably looks different in every organization, but also in different size organizations. I think, in a larger organization, you can have people who their job is effectively to audit and, kind of maintain that standard.
Yeah.
I think in organizations our size, you have to rely more on sort of like group meetings and stuff like that, where it's like, we are implementing this. Let's go over it together. Let's make sure everybody understands it.
That's a good, yeah.
Because I think, because otherwise there is no point in the process. Well, maybe that we need to actually step back and ask why, and if it's possible to create a different point in the process. But as it stands, there's probably not a point in the process that requires somebody to reference that. So
I wonder if we could do something like for a lot of like often repeated tasks. I wonder if we could sort of say like the first time you do it in the day, you follow the SOP. Or the first day of the week, you follow the SOP, or something. Because I think the regular check-in, again, around like building habits, I think the regular check-ins to SOPs as a foundation for growing an organization would be huge.
Yeah.
In terms of training, like onboarding someone, we had this. Onboarding for us was not a big deal. Like, it wasn't super simple, but relative to what I hear other people talk about, it was like we had a lot of standards. We have video trainings on certain stations, not all of them by any means. Our tasks are pretty simplified because we've spent a lot of time improving things, labeling things, color coding things. Like, it makes a huge difference. And I think that this is sort of not a last piece for sure, but a substantial chunk that I'm now becoming aware of that we don't do.
Yeah.
Is we've now created, like I've talked over the last few weeks about like, oh, we've been making SOPs and it's great and it's helpful and all that.
Yeah.
Now we have to read the SOPs that we made.
Yeah. One thing and we kind of came across this in our shop a little bit this last week is, I think it's easy to write an SOP that describes a process and then to create a checklist that reflects the state of the product. And they don't necessarily agree with each other. And I think it can be helpful to make checklists that reflect the SOP directly. So instead of like, it's a difference between...
Can you give an example?
Yeah. Well, I'm trying to figure out how to like clearly define this. Instead, like I think often our checklists are like, is that part too standard, or is this thing in a certain state? Okay. Instead of did I do this process? Did I do
step 1? Did I do step 2? Not what is the result?
Kind of. Yeah. Process versus result maybe is the clearest way to say it.
A theme. No.
Yeah. So I think there is some merit to creating, maybe not an everyday, but a checklist that directly reflects the SOP, or writing the SOP in a way that it has a checklist sort of built in.
Yeah, I think like Toyota, as far as I understand, has 3 documents at each process. Right. One is like super in depth. The other one is less in depth. And the last one is actually like a working document that you're meant to work off of.
Yeah.
I'm not sure we're going to get there quite yet, but I see the need. And I think that's sort of what you're talking about. Is like maybe that checklist is that last step of just making sure all the things get done.
Yeah.
And if you're curious about a particular step, there is... I think one is sort of a working document. The other is a how, and then the last one has why in it also. Because if you want to update a process, it's very useful to be able to understand the why behind its current state.
Yeah.
Especially because I think like often there's weird steps that get introduced that are actually quality issues that resulted in adding those steps, right? Like it avoids this failure we saw this one time.
Yeah.
So we do it this way. And it's like, okay, good.
Right. That's very hard.
And you won't see that problem if the solution was effective because it eliminated that failure mode.
Yeah. Also, are your SOPs visible? It's hard to make them visible.
I pause because they are, but they are not prominently displayed. They are like, one of them is magneted out of convenience to the side of our sandblasting cabinet, but you don't work on the side of the sandblasting cabinet. You work at the front of the sandblasting cabinet. Yeah. So I've been thinking about that quite a bit. Is just generally, I think we have I don't know if it's a space issue. I think we need to put more time into making our stations visual rather than optimizing for like space. I think we may be able to do both, but like right now it's like, oh, we'll jam this in this corner, and there's no consideration for what visuals need to be displayed in design. Yeah. I think often.
I think there's also kind of like we were talking about with QC, is tying these things into the process in one way or another.
Yeah.
So like what comes to mind is making like the check of the SOP or checklist or whatever it is, making that something you have to do before you do another step.
Right.
And sometimes it can feel a little arbitrary or like, artificial, but if it's something like you can't close this latch to close the door on the sandblaster before you put this thing on it.
Right.
And that thing has the checklist on it or something. So you have to, whatever. That's not a good example, but creating some sort of arbitrary step that inserts a step where you have to look at it or are reminded to look at it in one way or another seems like it's not ideal, but it seems like maybe the next best step. And you're not assuming you're not relying simply on people's good memory. You have to, there's at least some reminder to go and check this thing.
Yeah. It's funny. I feel like there's this dichotomy of the Toyota production system treats people like machines, but in a respectful way, meaning like on one hand, it can feel oppressive to be like, here's a list for every single thing, but actually underneath it is the way we support machines is because they're not capable of like deep thought and memory and all this stuff. We don't assume they'll do that. And so we build really good cells for them. At the same time, I think we load people's working memory. We load people's ability to like on the fly problem solve and like dexterity and all this stuff needlessly, which prevents them from actually doing more creative work and creative problem solving. I think the key part there, though, is giving people the freedom and the time to implement what they've thought up, right? So in like a production plant where there's no time and there's only an emphasis on throughput, just telling people exactly how to do every step is, I think, dehumanizing to a large degree.
Yeah, I think it kind of like hearkening back to our conversation about asking people to improve your process, but not then sharing in the results with monetarily. I think similarly, if you ask people to conform to a process but then don't allow some aspect of creativity, you're asking for a bad result. So people are willing to do that if they are.
Well, I think it's also soul crushing. Like that is.
Yeah. No, absolutely soul crushing. But if you're allowing them to be creative in that process, and they are creating the process in which they work, I think it can function.
Yeah,
I've heard that from some people who work in small businesses in the area that have like very strong methodologies, and they're like, it's dehumanizing. Yeah, but I think it's.
But if at the end of the day they were just kind of like, now we're gonna update all those, like go for it, update it and try it tomorrow a different way. Yeah. Then it's kind of exciting and interesting. I think and that's definitely what's kept me interested in making buckles for, at this point, years. Yeah. Right? Like I'm doing basically the same thing every day in a lot of areas. Yeah. Which would get really boring. But when it's suddenly like a creative problem solving experiment every day, it's pretty interesting. Yeah. And then the opportunity of actually implementing and taking time to engineer creative solutions is like something I haven't gotten to do on a lot of other projects because the volume isn't there, because I'm on the R&D phase and that's treated very separately from the production phase of a project.
I've gotten the same feedback from my people that it's fun to be part of a process where we are trying to improve continuously. Yeah. And that is enjoyable.
It is one of the things people talk about is just much higher retention at companies that implement like lean TPS, whatever you want to call it, but just continuous improvement.
I did after last week, I forget what the question was, about, if my employees have felt like doing this stuff was beneficial. I did talk to them and the answer was yes. They enjoy it. They feel included. It doesn't, they feel like they're part of the process and it's exciting and it is making life better.
Nice.
So to anybody who was wondering,
the results are in.
The results are in. Exactly.
The sample size is small.
It's very
the
small.
Results are in.
Yeah.
No, our sample size is small, but there's plenty of.
The trend is clear.
The trend is clear, and there's a bunch of I read studies a while ago, sort of surveys of shops and whether they have like an explicit methodology for continuous improvement and its effects on their revenue and profits and many other factors. And the answer is yes. Yeah. I have a couple other topics here. One is sort of a brief, well, maybe brief. It's a big topic, but we don't have to dive into it fully. On the topic of SOPs and their contribution to organizational learning, I think that, so we mentioned that some of the advantage that Japanese companies had in the 80s was attributed to their ability, their focus on organizational learning over individual learning. A big focus in a lot of those companies is sort of like respect for people, improve your people, invest in your people, right?
Yeah.
Putting huge amounts of energy into educating people, into letting them try new ideas. I think part of the ROI on that, because at the end of the day, like these are businesses, right?
Yeah.
Like they do have to make money.
Yeah, and a lot of those businesses are notorious for being not cutthroat's not the right word, but very profit driven.
Very profit driven, and very good at successfully profit driven. Yeah. So I think organizational learning allows for investing in people more substantially because okay, for example, Sam spent a lot of time learning about SOPs. He also spent, as a separate project, a lot of time learning about QR codes and barcodes.
On the clock.
Yeah. That is not very useful to the business if he leaves, firstly. It's only useful to the business if he spends enough time making QR codes and barcodes and SOPs over the course of his time here. However long that turns out to be, to make up for the time he spent on it. I think if he made a YouTube video or he made an SOP or some document, and we had systems in the company for creating those documents, tracking those documents, knowing those documents exist to refer to later, suddenly we've now, as an organization, acquired that skill.
Yeah.
Versus right now, Sam has acquired that skill. And not like I'm excited that he knows those things because he's here.
Yeah.
But I think that is sort of essential is having those systems in place for the people who do the work to sort of share about that information.
Yeah.
And that is sort of the reciprocal, that is like the benefit to the company. And then the benefit to the individual is that the company can suddenly spend a huge amount of time and money investing in them learning.
Yeah.
Because it becomes the organization's learning, not just their learning. Similarly, like we just launched a new product, and I want to do a product debrief of like start building documents, because I was reading about these documents that Toyota has around like design guidelines, and they're not hard rules, right? Like their example on eliminating squeaks and noises from cars, it was basically like the page on that was something like, I'll probably miss a bit, but something like, prevent relative motion, or allow for enough space for relative motion without touching, or use materials that don't make noise when you have relative motion, right? Like it's not
right,
but like that's so powerful to have that document where you just go through it at the end of a phase of the project of like, did we get all of this? Oh no, we didn't. Here, let's fix this. And instead of like hitting production and being like, wow, all of these cars squeak a little bit when you hit a speed bump, and that happens, right? Like there are cars that do that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's because of this. And the really curious thing to me is always like, you get in a car seat and it's really comfortable, and then the car company comes out with their like new version of that car, and you get in the seat and you're like, these seats are really uncomfortable. Like, how do you go from a company building comfortable seats to a company building uncomfortable seats. Always weird.
Yeah.
I think this is why.
Yeah.
Because there's not good.
They've got there's barriers on the lane to keep things on track in the same direction.
Yeah, and I think the temptation is to build like hardcore documents of like it has to be this or it has to be that, or like build like writing too much about it.
Mm-hmm.
But like if we had a document about here's and a constantly updated document, here's how we launch new products. Do you have videos explaining how to use the thing?
Mm-hmm.
Do you have, like, we launched without good imagery that immediately shows people what it would be useful for?
Yeah.
So we got a lot of people being like, wow, congrats on the new launch. Also, what does it do? And I was like, damn, right. Like, my head was so in it the whole time. I know exactly what it does.
Yeah. I think this is one place where like kind of the job shop mentality comes into play.
Yeah.
Which is good, is not being too specific because you can't be.
Yeah,
and
totally.
Having to remember to identify the broad strokes of a process instead of the details of a process.
That is a very good point.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's that. All right. I have another quick one and then a less quick one. The quick one is we've been talking about my CNC being turned the wrong direction for...
Yeah, you mention it often.
Often?
Yeah.
It's one of those things. It's a big project to spin it around at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
Big as in, I don't know, it'll be a few hours and then we have to reorganize all the space, right?
It's not nothing.
And so the other day I was just curious, like, what is this actually costing us?
Yeah.
And my guess is that it's about 5 seconds of walking each way.
Uh-huh.
So a round trip is about a little over 10 seconds probably.
Yeah.
Realistically. At about $30 an hour cost to the organization, mm-hmm. that's almost 1 cent per second. It's like 0.8 cents per second.
Okay.
And then the question is, how many trips do we do back and forth? My guess, and I think this is conservative, is like 20 through the course of the day.
Uh-huh. Like to check on stuff.
Check on it, reload it, do a changeover. And then also there's a computer over there that I use for CAD and some other stuff. And so I'm back and forth for that.
Yep.
And if I'm working over there, I'll walk to the rest of the shop to like check in on Sam, or like if I have something to tell him.
Sure.
So like there's a lot of two things. One, every necessary trip is longer. Two, there's a lot of necessary trips because it's not line of sight.
Yeah.
And so I'm guessing the cost is around $2 per day, mm-hmm. which equates to about $40 a month. That's pure waste. That's by the way.
Few decent like streaming service subscriptions.
Yeah, or like snacks for the shop, or profit, or savings for the customer.
What's profit?
Or more money for Shunk, you know.
Yeah, exactly. Profit for Shunk.
Yeah. Anyway, so I don't know that quantifying that made me, like, it's not like $500 a month.
Right. You're not necessarily like, I have to do this tomorrow.
Yeah.
But when you think it seems like it's one of those things that's indicative of a larger, I don't know. It's like sometimes having the detail on one thing helps you like step back and see it in totality in the shop and be like, okay, this is actually a priority as a whole.
Yeah.
Maybe we don't need to move that machine tomorrow because it's not going to save us $1,000 a day.
Yeah.
But maybe we do need to actually make this a priority as a whole in the shop, because we're probably, if you look at this one and then you look at another one and then another one, we're probably spending $300 or $400 a month on labor that is total waste. Yeah. It's
so walking
hard though.
Walking from our shipping station to our assembly station is also could be eliminated. Yeah. Mostly. And so that probably has a cost of, similar.
Yeah.
We're probably spending $2 a day on that distance. Yeah. So if you add all of them up, we just built a loft, which has been really useful for growing and also really detrimental for traveling.
Right. Because you have to go up and down a ladder every time.
Yeah. Carrying stuff. And then you forget something downstairs that you need. And so you're walking back downstairs. And then to put this into perspective, a piece in the book that I'm reading, they were talking about Toyota constantly pushing to reduce costs.
Yeah.
And they were talking about using gloves because you have to keep the interior of the car clean or different parts clean. And so they use disposable gloves. And so if you can eliminate but if you get your gloves dirty, you have to change the gloves.
Yeah.
And so the question is, how frequently do you change the gloves? And they're basically like, these gloves, and I think this was a made up example, but say it costs 25 cents per car.
Uh-huh.
That's not much.
Yeah.
But if you think about producing 200,000 cars a year,
yeah,
that's on that one production line. If you can come up with a standard operating procedure that, say, touches the dirty parts last, or eliminate or switches that job to someone else or something, you can suddenly save 25 cents per car. And if everyone is doing that in the whole organization all the time, it's powerful,
impactful.
Yeah. Powerful to the tune of, I forget when this data is from, but like Toyota's profits, even though they ship fewer cars, were more than the top 3 car producers combined.
Oh, and from the Toyota Way, that example. I think that was 2019.
Yeah, so that's something,
Yeah. Yeah.
I aspire to do that.
Significantly lower overall revenue, lower cars produced than the next, lower cars produced than
any of
them, not combined, but any of them.
Any one of them.
But higher profits than the 3 combined, right?
Yeah.
The 3 next profitable combined.
And I haven't checked those things for myself. That was just from that book.
Yeah.
Which I assume is correct. But
one would hope.
Anyway, so I think like quantifying a lot of these different wastes is really useful, because I think we've talked about this, but I just feel this constant uphill battle of like becoming habituated to the way we're currently doing things. And so you sort of become blind to it.
Yeah.
Another one is like, I vacuum up our sandblaster, but also our bandsaw area gets shavings.
Yeah.
And I can totally build shields that cut that down by 90% easily. And it's like, all right, yeah, and I realized I had all these big ideas of like 3D printing something because it's quick, but it's like then the CAD time is going to be crazy.
Yeah.
Or I could do sheet metal. I'm just going to do cardboard just to start.
Just try it out.
Yeah. And I feel like it'll work, and
I'll probably be there for the next 5 years.
I mean, ideally it will. Yeah. And if it's not, I'll change it out but I can use it as a pattern.
Yeah.
Last topic I have here, and then we should wrap up, is overnight runs of the CNC.
Yeah. So
I just reprogrammed to get a 4-hour run.
It's so hip these days.
It really is. Lights out machining. 4-hour run, which actually already has been really beneficial because it opened up time during the day for prototyping. I was like, oh, we have a lot to machine, but I can do that after I leave. So question.
Since you were talking about reducing your Kanban quantities, how does this fit with that? Yeah, so and needing to make 4 or 6, potentially 6 different types of parts in a day. Yeah, so that's what I'm trying to figure out. So we're doing 4-hour run. I think we can get up to a 16-hour run. The questions I have is how to think about that capacity because it is increased risk. So like if we're fully counting on it succeeding and you come in the morning and it only ran for half the night before it like did a tool break detect and the tool broke and then it stops, you're suddenly losing a lot of production that you were counting on. Yeah. Whereas during the day, someone is presumably there, and so you will lose less of the day. Mm-hmm. And I don't know. So like obviously I could do sister tooling with tool break detect on my tools that I think are going to break. I'm running out of tool slots. I think you had sort of mentioned, because we talked about this a few weeks ago, you had sort of mentioned like, I don't know, like to your question now about how does that play into Kanban and reducing batch sizes, because it's the opposite of that. Yeah. I'm kind of trying to figure out exactly how that like works with our current Kanban system, and then also how to think about that capacity. Like, do we plan it out as in like we're not counting on that stuff to use the next day, we're only counting on it as our sort of weekly targets? It seems like you have to add a buffer zone. Yeah. And instead of like pulling directly from the CNC, which is how it does now, like to trigger CNC production, paint would pull from the buffer, and then the buffer would trigger the machine. And so instead of making like some of every part per day, you'd look at it more on a weekly flow and be pulling from that buffer, which it seems like could be actually really beneficial in a bunch of ways. I mean, there is the risk like you're talking about, but if like kind of going back to theory of constraints methodology, if you make sure that that buffer can account for potential scrap and you have makeup time built in, which if you're doing overnight runs but not fully, but you don't need 24-hour day production yet, that should be possible. It could allow you a lot more flexibility, like more overall production, and you could lower your paint Kanban quantities considerably because you're just pulling from that buffer instead of it having to be tied to the production flow in the machine.
True.
Getting away from single piece flow.
Yeah.
But with your current state, it might be better overall flow.
Yeah, and I think there's an example in the Toyota way of a company that ran parts overnight, right, in massive quantities. And that was, do you remember this one? I'm trying to think what they were building. But it was basically, the opposite of smaller batch sizes.
Yeah.
And they picked the parts to run overnight that were basically the lowest risk parts. And overall, it allowed them, I forget what they were after, production leveling? I think because they did it every night. I don't remember exactly what they were after, but it was like the solution to their problem was bigger batch sizes run overnight.
Yeah.
Also, theory of constraints, like at some point we are bumping up against the limits of our time on the mill. There's a lot of ways to solve that problem. One is working hours in the day gets extended. The other is reducing cycle time. We're sort of trying to attack it on both fronts.
Yeah. It seems like if you do it in a thoughtful way and account for the risks.
Yeah.
And like you're saying, if you run parts that you rarely have issues with during the day in larger batches, then you run your stable parts at night in larger batches, you are going to, you could, double your runtime potentially or more, right?
Yeah. I think more than double. So I think...
I think the buffer is worth that increased capacity.
Yeah. So theory of constraints, I forget the 5 steps.
Identify the constraint.
Yeah.
Exploit
the constraint, I think.
Let me look it up again real quick.
So what I put down here is we are exploiting the bottleneck, which it's not currently our bottleneck. I was sort of wondering, seeing as it's so hard to identify our bottleneck, I was sort of thinking it might just be useful to start looking at different areas of the business as a bottleneck. Like, what is our labor bottleneck? What is our production bottleneck? Do you know what I mean? Because it's sort of hard to...
Yeah, so it's identify the constraint, exploit the constraint, subordinate everything else to the constraint, elevate the constraint, and then don't stop now, find the next constraint. I think subordinate everything is kind of what we're discussing here, which is like subordinate your goal of single piece flow.
Of like no inventory.
To the fact that the constraint needs to produce more to keep up with demand.
Yeah. And so I think all those steps.
It does, sorry to interrupt, but
No.
It does seem like having a buffer there may give you flexibility to refine other aspects, like other constraints in the business in a way that might be very beneficial.
Yeah. So something I'm looking at now is like, as we get close to really needing that mill to be running 100% of the time for production, is that we lose our ability to improve that process of like playing around on the mill to improve whatever, cycle time reduction, trying a new tool path, that kind of thing. If you need 100% uptime, that's sort of impossible.
Yeah.
Obviously, buy a second mill is the answer to that problem.
You
but
mean 100% uptime during working hours?
Just in general, if we have no spare time.
Right. Which right now you have no spare time during your 8-hour workday.
Right. And so pushing this stuff to the night allows us sort of to push off needing a second mill to improve. So we've identified the bottleneck as the mill for for a substantial increase in throughput of buckles. Because we've been able to sort of add capacity to the other steps pretty easily, right? Like the tumbling isn't very expensive. this new deal we're working on is probably going to be anodized, so our paint isn't the constraint.
Yeah.
We've worked on our assembly jigs, and we have spare labor in assembly. So we've identified the bottleneck. Exploiting the bottleneck, I think like turning it off for 16 hours a day is an
not
egregious
exploiting
use of the bottleneck. Yeah. And so I think that's a big piece of like first step is let's run like after we leave, and let's run right in the morning. And so what's that? And then what is it? Subordinate. And so subordinating to the bottleneck, one thought I had, and I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this. We were talking about adding branding to the buckles.
Yep.
There's a question of whether to do it in the mill or on a laser. I think you're right that doing it in the mill it's definitely less labor.
Yeah.
And so it's probably lower cost. But I'm sort of wondering, it is adding cycle time to our bottleneck. And so I was kind of wondering if for that reason we should push it to a laser.
Uh-huh.
So that was a thought.
I think that probably depends on the specifics of the process and the specifics of the requirements, like how many different things you're going to need to engrave.
Yeah.
If it's the same thing every time, well, I don't know.
Yeah.
It can cut both ways.
Yeah, I'm on the fence about that one. But then the last piece that we're trying to figure out, I'm sure it's not the last piece. I don't know why I keep saying that. The thing that's been on my mind a lot lately is like, right now we do Kanban that triggers production on the mill. That Kanban we just do it in the order it was triggered.
Uh-huh.
But I think what we need to start doing is having a 24-hour schedule on the mill and tuck those Kanbans in so that we know it's going to run through lunch, and so that we know we will have enough time at the end of the day to have a clean break, change over to a 4 to 16 hour run for the nighttime, and then also have the Kanban for the person who's starting at 4 a.m. the next morning.
Yeah. That is the challenge, it seems like, to me with overnight runs, which has been obviously there's a bunch of big hang-ups with trying to run overnight. But the biggest one for me, given the variability of our work, is trying to time it so that it starts when you leave or starts in the later half of the day. Because right now we have no way of guaranteeing that aside from like idling machines, potentially. Which could...
When would you have to idle them? Like in the afternoon to get ready for an overnight run? Or
well, if we were like, okay, we're going to start this job, it's probably going to run 7 hours. We start at 11 o'clock.
Yeah.
That's only going to run for a very short time after we leave.
Yeah.
So I guess that's better than nothing. But if we're like, okay, what we really need to get on the machine is this other thing, but this is going to end after we leave, then it doesn't start till the next day, and then it starts during the day. And it seems like timing things so that they end at, say, 3 o'clock in time for a changeover is challenging.
Is challenging. I think what I'm realizing, and I'm sure other people have had this realization, is like pushing for overnight runs. I think people are driven to that when they're at capacity during the day. Mm-hmm. But it seems like a worthwhile, and we're just on the edge of that. We got a few big RFQs that have driven us to sort of explore the idea. Mm-hmm. But I think, like for you, an idle machine during the day is actually good. If you're running the stuff you would have ridden during the day at night, having it idle during the day, you could prove out. This would be a great example of like local optimum versus global optimum. Mm-hmm. You could do an extra changeover to prove out a program that you're going to run the next day. Then do another changeover back to the thing, run it overnight, and then roll in the next day, and you're like ready to run.
Yeah, that's true. I probably need to just change my mindset. I've been like aware of that concept, but for some reason, like it actually making that mental shift is hard.
Well, my tune may shift. I ran my first long...
Stay tuned, folks.
We were joking before the episode about Schrodinger's spindle. I ran the first long run on Friday, and I haven't been back in the shop. So after this podcast, I'll walk back over there and see how it did. Stay tuned.
I think that is good for me to remember that we could just potentially run, assuming the system was robust enough, run everything at night.
Yeah.
And use the day for prove out. And because that is often what we end up doing anyway. And
but then you don't have the night run.
But then we don't have the night run.
Yeah. I think going back to the question of like walking around the machine and how much that costs.
Yeah.
Walking from the shipping station to the assembly station and how much that costs. Looking at overnight runs and the available throughput of 16 hours.
Yeah.
With all of those examples, the second you quantify that dollar value, it suddenly opens up the budget massively for getting there, right? Like suddenly a robot that can load in sister tooling on my mill, if that means we get whatever, I don't know what, 4 hours extra runtime per night. I mean, sister tooling in my case is not the limiting factor.
Yeah.
But a robot's cost, say you spend whatever $10,000 to $30,000 on a robot, 16 hours a day, like extra per day, that's a lot of uptime. And I think it's funny because people add spindles to their shop, right?
Yeah.
But this is basically adding 2 spindles to your shop and you could, spend half the cost of a machine for a pretty robust system.
For everybody who didn't follow, that's because one spindle
running
with a normal
hours.
work day gets you 8 hours. If you can run an additional 16 hours a day, that's equivalent to 2 more spindles.
Yeah, basically. Anyway, which isn't 100% realistic, but it's interesting to think about.
Yeah.
Like the added back to like problem solving. I think we get stuck on how much capacity do we have in the shop?
Yeah.
Okay, we need a new mill. It's like, what's the problem? It's like, okay, it's basically hours. It's not machines. It's easy to get stuck on the machines because you look around and there's no available machines.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there's a lot of hours of it sitting idle. So anyway.
Yeah. Most of the majority of machines' lives.
Yeah. Through the whole weekend and every single night.
Yeah.
Kind of depressing.
Yeah. On that note.
And solvable, which is cool.
That part is exciting.
Yeah.
Cool. Can we wrap it up?
Let's wrap it up. Thanks all for listening.
Indeed. We'll see you
on Friday.
3 days. 2 days? 3 days?
2 days.
2 days. Have a good one.